Hey everyone, Eric here, and welcome to another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast. Hope you are hanging in there. I am so glad to have Buddy Moorehouse with me on the show today. He is a veteran of the newspaper industry, working 26 years as an editor for the Livingston County Daily Press in Pontiac, and he was named the top newspaper columnist in Michigan by the Associated Press in 2009. He has also worked in public relations and documentary filmmaking and is a 2-time Emmy nominee for documentary filming. He is here to talk about a book he wrote in 2021. It is called Murder of an Elvis Girl, Solving the Jenny Maxwell Case. And it's so great to have you on. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes. So this is a story that is personal to you and your family. Would you share that family connection with us?
Sure. So Jenny Maxwell was a really famous Hollywood actress in the late 50s and into the 60s. Her biggest role was in the movie Blue Hawaii with Elvis Presley, where she played one of the Elvis girls in the movie. And Jenny was my mother's first cousin. So my mom is 6.5 years older than Jenny is, and they were both daughters of Norwegian brothers who came over, immigrated from Norway in the early 1900s. My grandfather was the oldest son in the family. His name was Elling, and Jenny's dad, whose name was Jonas, they changed his name to John when he got to the United States, was Elling's younger brother. So my grandfather and Jenny's dad were brothers who both came over from Norway. My grandpa moved to the Chicago area, and Jenny's dad moved to New York City, lived in Brooklyn his whole life. So my mom grew up in Chicago, and Jenny grew up in Brooklyn. And when they were younger, my mom was really close to Jenny. Every summer, she would take the train out from Chicago to Brooklyn and babysit her. And she just absolutely adored Jenny, and Jenny loved her. They were both into acting and doing plays. So when my mom would go out there, her name was Vera. When she would go out and visit Jenny, they would write plays and perform them for the neighborhood kids. So they were very, very close when they were younger. So that's the family connection. That's how I'm related to Jenny. She's I think it's first cousin once removed, but she was my mom's first cousin.
Got it. So Jenny, she was really young, right? When she began acting. How did she get her big break?
Yeah, and it's a great question, and it is literally exactly like you hear about in the movies. She was literally discovered by a Hollywood director. Jenny was in Brooklyn, loved acting. She took modeling lessons, she took dance lessons, singing lessons, and she was enrolled in this theater school in Brooklyn. And the person who owned the theater school, who ran the theater school, was good friends with Vincente Minnelli, the Hollywood director, Liza Minnelli's dad, Judy Garland's former husband. So Vincente Minnelli was over there visiting his friend who ran this theater school in Brooklyn. And he looks on stage and he sees this beautiful blonde girl who was 16 years old up there acting, and he literally goes, "Who is that? I need her to audition for this movie that I'm doing with Frank Sinatra." So it was Jenny. She was literally discovered by Liza Minnelli's dad at a theater school in Brooklyn, and that's how her theater career started. Her movie career. So the movie was it was called Some Came Running. It was a film that Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin were in, and Vincente Minnelli was going to direct it, and he was looking for someone to play Frank Sinatra's niece, and he thought Jenny would be perfect for the role. So he flew Jenny and her mom, whose name was Annie, he flew them out to Hollywood and had her do all kinds of screen tests with Frank Sinatra for the role. And she didn't get that part because the director ultimately, when he saw everything together, he wanted to go with somebody who was a brunette instead of a blonde. So Jenny didn't get the role, but when she was out there, she got hooked up with an agent who said, don't worry about that. There are people who are going to love you out here. So within days of her audition for Some Came Running, she ended up landing a part on Father Knows Best, which was her first TV role that she had. And then her Hollywood career just kind of took off from there. So by that time she was 17 years old, and it was 1958, and she was already a Hollywood actress at that time.
Yeah. So it was difficult though too, right? Because her family was back in New York. Her dad wasn't necessarily interested in moving out to Hollywood, right?
No, not at all. Her mother was kind of on board with it, but her dad, my great uncle, he was very dead set against Jenny moving out to Hollywood and becoming an actress. When she said she wanted to become an actress, Johnny thought that it meant that she was going to be a Broadway actress and that she was going to stay in New York City. He had no idea that she was going to move across the country and move to Hollywood. But as things worked out, that's where her career was going to be. So Johnny had no desire whatsoever to move over to L.A. to be near his daughter. He worked building skyscrapers. That was his dream when he was over in Norway. He wanted to move to America and build skyscrapers, so that's what he did. And he had no desire to move across the country to be with his daughter. So Annie and Johnny stayed in New York the entire time when Jenny was out in Hollywood. And, her career just started to take off, and then she started to make an awful lot of bad decisions.
So she's doing really well career-wise on television, like you said, starting in the 50s, late 50s, into the early 60s, getting a lot of roles on popular shows. But then she meets a man named Paul Rapp, and unfortunately, this relationship did not go well. Would you tell us more about that?
Sure. So Jenny's career, like you said, in the late 50s, she got her first role in 1958, and she started getting all these roles on, usually mostly on sitcoms, but also a few dramas. She was on Bonanza. She was on Bachelor Father. She ended up later getting on My Three Sons. If you look up if you see old reruns from the 1960s and early 1960s and late 50s, you're going to see Jenny all over the place on all those shows. And one of her roles, she met this man named Paul Rapp, who was an assistant director who was 6 years older than she was. And Paul Rapp's father was very famous in Hollywood. He was a man named Philip Rapp, he was personal friends with Bob Hope. He had created the radio show The Bickersons, which later became a TV series in itself. And so Philip Rapp was very well known in Hollywood. Paul Rapp, his son, was an assistant director who met Jenny on one of the shoots, and he was 23, 24 when they met, and Jenny was 17. And they fell in love really quickly, and Jenny had no parents in in Los Angeles to keep her on the straight and narrow. And Paul and Jenny just decided that they wanted to get married. So it was literally in the middle of one of her shoots for a movie called Blue Denim that she was in. She left for the weekend, went to Arizona with Paul Rapp, and they got married. They eloped, came back, and then told everybody that they were married. And didn't tell her family about it before it happened or anything. My mom back in Illinois had no clue any of this was happening. And so she goes and gets married and comes back and tells her parents that she got married, and they just flipped out about it. They were so upset. She was 17 years old, living in Hollywood all by herself, and now she's married.
One of the scenes in your book that stuck out to me was when Paul Rapp sees Jenny flirting with Michael Landon on the set of Bonanza.
Yeah, Paul was very, very jealous, and Jenny loved the fact that that Paul got so jealous of that. So Jenny would take advantage of that any chance that she possibly could on there. So she flirted with, anyone and everyone. And she had a role in Bonanza, where she had a lot of scenes with Michael Landon in the role that she was playing in there. And she was flirting as much as she possibly could. And when Paul found out about it, he just got totally irate over it, which happened a lot on there. And Jenny just loved every bit of that.
And you write that Michael Landon was married at the time, but he was still happily flirting right back, right?
Oh, yeah.
That's the story.
That was how the story went, yes.
So she was a 1960s Deb star. Would you explain what a Deb star was?
That was a thing that the makeup and hairdress people in whatever that organization was back in Hollywood at the time, they had this big thing they would do every year where they would name the Deb Stars, like the Deb Stars of 1960, the Deb Stars. It was short for debutante. And it was basically, they had this big TV series or big TV show every year where they would unveil the Deb Stars as though this was like the coming out party for these famous Hollywood people, who are, young starlets who were about to become big. So Jenny in early 1960, she's 19 years old at the time, she'd gotten pregnant, and she had a son named Brian, who was born in 1960. And, 19 years old, now she's not only a wife, but a mother. And just a couple months after she had Brian, her agent was able to get her to be named a Deb Star of 1960. So in October of that year, she was on a TV special that was hosted by Bob Hope, and Joan Crawford was the co-host for this, where they would introduce each of these Deb Stars. And so Joan Crawford actually read the introduction for Jenny at the time. And what was really interesting about that was not only that this kind of cemented her as, the next big thing in Hollywood, but when Jenny first hit it big in Hollywood, or first started to hit it big in Hollywood, for whatever reason, her publicity agent or her agent decided that they were going to tell everybody that, number one, that she was from Norway, that she grew up in Norway, because that sounded a lot more exotic than that she grew up in Brooklyn. So Jenny was not from Norway. She'd never even been there her entire life. But they decided that, okay, it's going to be really exotic if we say she's from Norway. So they introduced her as a Norwegian beauty. And the second lie that they told was that she was Marilyn Monroe's cousin, which was entirely not true. The way that rumor started or came about was that Jenny's mom was from this tiny town in Norway called Haugesund. And the guy who was listed on Marilyn Monroe's birth certificate as her father, who was really not her father, was a guy whose family was from the same small town. So when Marilyn Monroe started to hit it big, everybody in the small town in Norway started claiming that they were related to Marilyn Monroe, including Jenny's family. So that's how the rumor in the family might have started. But when the PR people found out about it, they decided that, okay, she's Marilyn Monroe's cousin. So when Joan Crawford introduced her on the Deb Stars of 1960 special, they introduced her as a second cousin of Marilyn Monroe. And none of that, of course, was true. But it didn't matter. She was now, an even bigger Hollywood star than she was before.
I'm a big fan of the original Twilight Zone series, and I was surprised to see her name in one of my favorite episodes. And it's a favorite for many.
Yeah, she was in an episode that was called Long Distance Call, where she played Billy Mooney's babysitter. And the whole episode is that this little boy's grandmother dies, and he starts picking up this toy phone and having conversations with his dead grandmother on there. Very spooky episode, very creepy episode, and like you said, one of the best known and best loved episodes in there. And Jenny had a real pivotal role in that one.
So yeah, let's talk about Blue Hawaii. Can you kind of talk about how that came about and what her experience was like on the set?
Yeah, so Jenny in 1960, and especially after she was named one of the Deb Stars, was really on everybody's radar in Hollywood. And when they started making plans for this movie that they were going to film in 1961 called Blue Hawaii, the director had seen Jenny and seen her in some of the TV things that she had done, including Long Distance Call on the Twilight Zone, the Deb Star special. Really thought that she would be perfect for this role. So if you haven't seen the movie Blue Hawaii, Elvis Presley plays a GI, gets out of the army, comes back to his family in Hawaii. They want him to work running the family pineapple plantation, but he wants to be a travel agent instead because that's a lot more exciting. So, giving tours of Hawaii to people. So one of the groups that he has is this group of college girls who come over and need to be shepherded around the island for a few days. And one of them is this bratty girl named Ellie Corbett, who is very beautiful, but very, very bratty. And she's by far the most memorable one in the movie. And that was Jenny. So she flirts with Elvis. She has a lot of scenes with him. She tries hitting on Elvis at one point in there. And there's a very well-known scene in the movie where Elvis actually spanks her. It's nothing you'd ever see in a movie today, but it was one of the most famous Elvis movie scenes of all time. But Blue Hawaii filmed in 1961, early 1961, in this resort in Hawaii. And basically everybody lived there for a few months while they were filming it. Well, Jenny had a relatively new baby at the time. Brian was about 8 or 9 months old when they went over there. And Paul Rapp, her husband, was not about to let her go over to Hawaii for a couple months on her own with Elvis Presley and, who knows who else might be there without him being around. So he insisted on coming along to Hawaii for this. Jenny told her agent, okay, we'll pay for it, but Paul has to come and he has to be there along with me, and we also have to bring Brian along. So when she went out there for the filming of Blue Hawaii, they were out there for a couple months, and Paul and Brian were out there with them. And Paul got very jealous anytime Jenny was spending all this time around Elvis, not just on the set. There was talk that Elvis had made a pass at Jenny in there. I did put a scene in the book that had that in there. And the other really interesting thing that happened on there, and I heard this story from Brian, is that was where Brian took his very first steps. As a baby, it's where he walked for the very first time, was at this big bonfire at the rap party they're having at the very end. And in front of Elvis Presley and everyone, that's where Brian Rapp took his first steps. But it was a very definitely a very momentous event in their life.
Right. She's basically at the height of her popularity and so young. And she starts drinking, seriously drinking, partying.
Jenny was, if you think about it, when Blue Hawaii was filmed, she was still just 20 years old. She'd already been married for 3 years. She had a kid. She had a child at that time. She'd become one of the most famous actresses in Hollywood, and she was still just 20 years old. And she was not ready for adult life. And she didn't have a choice because she was married and she had a child. She needed to act responsibly, and she didn't. Her career still was doing okay. It had a couple of ups and downs throughout the early 60s after that. But her career was doing okay, but her marriage and particularly her role as a mother were going terribly on there. She was spending a lot more time partying than she was actually tending to her son on there. Her marriage was totally awful at that time. She was fighting with Paul, nonstop, and being a terrible mother to Brian. And, throughout the early and mid 60s, her personal life was just totally falling apart.
She was friends with Sharon Tate, too.
Yeah, so the way she met Sharon Tate was she was in a movie in 1963 called Take Her, She's Mine with Jimmy Stewart. Jimmy Stewart had a rebellious daughter played by Sandra Dee, who went off to this elite prep school, and it was a very 1960s movie. There were a lot of beatniks in it and hippies and things like that. And then Sandra Dee ends up going off to Europe and getting a boyfriend there. So when Jenny was on set there for the movie, one of the other people who was in the movie was, I think his last name is pronounced Forquet, but it's Philippe Forquet. And he was this French actor, really good looking French actor. And his girlfriend was Sharon Tate. So Jenny was I think 21 or 22 at the time. Sharon Tate was like 20. But they became good friends in that movie, and then they both started appearing in the gossip columns a lot. You look at newspapers from that during the filming of that movie, and Sharon Tate and Jenny Maxwell are showing up in all of these gossip columns together. So I'd heard from Brian that Jenny had a few really close friends in Hollywood. One of them was Peggy Lipton, who was later in the Mod Squad. Another one was an actress named Jill Banner, who was in a couple of horror movies in the 60s. And then Sharon Tate was also a good friend of hers. And it was because they met on that movie. And at that time, Sharon's career was just starting to take off. She ended up, one of her early roles was in the Beverly Hillbillies, where she played an employee at the bank who had a little romantic fling with Jethro in there. So Jenny's career was a little farther along at that point than Sharon's was. But yeah, they became good friends during that movie.
I think I know Peggy Lipton best from Twin Peaks.
Right.
But yeah, she was a great actress.
Yeah.
So as the 60s move along, right, Jenny kind of starts to lose a bit of her shine in the eyes of casting agents, producers, directors, right? And it doesn't help that she's continuing to drink. You write that she'd show up late to auditions, her breath smelling of alcohol, that kind of thing, right?
Yep. And the parts started getting less frequent. She also started to age a lot. You look at some of the TV appearances that she did when she was only like 24, 25 years old, and she looks like she's in her late 30s at that time. So the partying, the drinking was definitely taking a toll on her. And it was making it a lot harder for her to get the kind of roles that she was getting just a few years earlier on there. She had, I mean, if you think about, she's like one of the hottest actresses in the country when Blue Hawaii came out in November of 1961. The same week that Blue Hawaii came out, she was in an episode of Dr. Kildare, which was one of the top 10 shows in the country, TV shows in the country that year. So here she's in the hottest movie in the country, the one of the top TV shows in the country. And just a couple of years after that, it was hard for her agent to get her roles in anything. She ended up getting a really, really tiny role in Wagon Train. And it was in large part due to the fact that she was just so unreliable on there. And her Hollywood ways were really, really doing a number on her. But the biggest thing that happened to her in her personal life is that she lost custody of Brian. She, and this is in a time when fathers never, ever would get custody of children. If the mother wanted custody, the mother was always going to get custody. But Jenny had become such an irresponsible parent at the time that, and her parents supported this decision, that the judge actually awarded custody of Brian to Paul Rapp. So, Jenny was not only losing her career, but she lost her son at that time. And so by like 1967, 68 or so, she's just in a total spiral.
Right. I mean, she's even in an Ed Wood movie, right? And
yeah,
of course, he's known for making some of the worst films in Hollywood history.
She was in one of the worst movies. It was easily the worst movie that she ever did. It was a movie that Ed Wood had written. It was absolutely terrible.
Yeah. So would you tell us about Tip Roeder, who he was and how he enters the picture?
Yeah. So Jenny and Paul got divorced, obviously, in the 1960s. They were only married for a few years. Paul ended up suing for custody of Brian. He ended up getting custody of Brian. That was like 66 or so. He'd gotten custody of Brian. Jenny finally decided in 1968 that she wanted to turn her life around. She realized that she could not be both an actress and a mother at the same time. She was having a hard time handling just, one of those jobs, let alone both of them. So she made the decision in 1968 that she was going to give up her Hollywood career altogether. She was going to quit acting. She was 26 years old. Her very last role was in an episode of The Wild Wild West with Robert Conrad, the last role that she ever had. And she just decided that she was going to give up Hollywood entirely. And the reason was because she wanted to try to win back at least partial custody of Brian on there. So she wanted to show to the judge, show to the court that She was so dedicated now to being a mother that she was going to give up her Hollywood life to do that. So she quit being an actress, and eventually, I don't know exactly what year it was, but at some point she was able to win back at least partial custody of Brian, where she could see him on a more regular basis after that. So here she is. She's 26 years old, a 10-year Hollywood career that had gone from, nothing to hottest thing ever to almost disappearing from Hollywood's map. But she's done. In 10 years, she's done. So late 60s now, she realizes, I got to figure out something to do now. So to survive. So what she knows that she didn't want to do at that time was just get a normal job, working and, making money and being a normal person. So she figured, well, probably the best thing that I could do at this point is I need to find myself a rich husband and marry a rich husband. And that's when she met a guy named Tip Roeder. Tip Roeder was a very interesting person. He was an attorney at that time who was 20 years older than Jenny was. And they had met because Tip had a lot of connections in Hollywood. He was particularly close to an actor named Nick Adams, who also died under very mysterious circumstances. Nick Adams was Elvis Presley's best friend for a while. He was on a TV series called The Rebel. He was in Rebel Without a Cause. He was in No Time for Sergeants, and he was Tip Roeder's best friend. Tip was his attorney, and they were very, very close. And Jenny had met Tip at some point in the 1960s, and Tip had already been married 3 times, had 5 kids by 3 different wives at that point, and he was kind of looking for another wife who was going to be some Hollywood arm candy. He wanted to get a Hollywood actress as his 4th wife. He fancied himself as being that kind of a guy who could walk into any room and have a Hollywood actress on his arm. So he started pursuing Jenny in the late 1960s. They started dating a little bit, and finally, in 1970, he proposed and she accepted. And Jenny and Tip got married in 1970, and he was 49, she was 29 at the time. And as bad as Jenny's marriage was with Paul Rapp, her marriage with Tip Roeder ended up being even worse.
Yes, for sure. An interesting fact, when Tip Roeder first started working in Hollywood, his employer was an attorney that represented Lana Turner in the Johnny Stompanato murder case. So he was kind of knee-deep in the underworld early in his career.
Oh, yeah, it was an attorney named Louis Blau. That was the first job that he had. So Tip had a whole life before he became an attorney. Tip was a World War II vet, and when he got out of the war, he became a cop in Los Angeles. And when he became a cop, he, of course, as a lot of cops do there, he got to know all the bad guys in Los Angeles. A lot of mob guys at that time, and he started becoming fascinated with Hollywood at the time as well. So he went to law school when he was in his late 30s. He became an attorney at the age of 40, and he hooked up with that Louis Blau, who was kind of the attorney to the stars at that time. And so Tip started getting a lot of Hollywood clients early on as well, particularly in divorce cases, but he had a few other cases as well. So yeah, Tip was coming into contact with all kinds of Hollywood people and actresses, and and actors, but primarily actresses, and he loved it.
Yeah. You write that Jenny likely fell in love with Tip Roeder when he was cross-examining her ex-husband, Paul Rapp, on the stand, correct?
Yeah, they had an interesting connection that really comes into play in the book here. And I hope I don't make this too complicated. So Jenny is married to Paul Rapp. Jenny and Paul end up getting divorced. At the same time, Nick Adams, the actor, is married to a woman named Carol Nugent, who was also an actress at the time. And they had a really bad marriage as well. Well, Jenny and Paul get divorced, and Nick Adams is having trouble in his marriage with Carol Nugent. And along about that time, Paul Rapp starts having an affair with Carol Nugent. And they have 2 kids, 2 young kids at the time. and they're going through a terribly nasty divorce situation, and it's all because Carol's having an affair with Paul Rapp, and Paul Rapp had been disciplining her kids and doing all sorts of things that were going to get him in trouble later. So Jenny got a call from her attorney that said, there's a really interesting case going on at the courthouse right now. Your ex-husband is going to be called in this divorce case because he's been having an affair with Nick Adams' wife. And Jenny knew Nick Adams because they were on a TV show together. They were in the Joey Bishop show together, so she knew who Nick Adams was. So Jenny ends up going to court because she hates Paul Rapp, her ex-husband, and she wants to see him getting bludgeoned by whatever attorney it was. So she ends up going to court and watching it, and the attorney who ends up just ripping her ex-husband a new one is Tip Roeder. So it all kinds of connects and comes together at that time. So when, Jenny gets to see Tip Roeder in action, he's this big, tall bully of a guy, she just, fell for him at that time.
So throughout the 1970s, they remained married, yet they are living separate lives, in a sense.
So the good thing in Jenny's life in the 1970s, and I should say that at this point, when Jenny moved to Hollywood, she pretty much lost touch with my mom and the rest of the family. When she moved to Hollywood, she, of course, was in touch with her mom and dad, but she and my mom would exchange Christmas cards every year. But for the most part, we weren't getting, regular updates. We would just watch TV every so often and see Jenny on there. But she kind of lost touch with the Norwegian side of her family. But throughout the 1970s, the good thing that was happening in Jenny's life was that she was repairing her relationship with Brian. She was actually starting to become a more attentive mother. Brian would come over to their house all the time. He was really into skateboarding in the early years, so he would, skateboard all the time. He looked like a typical 1970s California kid. He had long blonde hair and eventually got into surfing. But Jenny and Brian were actually starting to have a decent relationship at that time. So that was the good thing in Jenny's life. And the bad thing was that her relationship with Tip just could not have been going worse. Just like it was with Brian, they fought all the time. They would argue all the time. They were, for the most part, living separate lives. They had this really nice house in Beverly Hills that they lived in that Jenny loved to decorate. But they when they did talk to each other, it was usually just to argue. So things were not going well in that marriage as well.
And they were both basically cheating on each other.
All the time. And Jenny would make a point of, she got to, and I heard this later from some of her friends and also from the police, but she got to the point where she would do it very publicly, and she would have one night stands with friends of his just because she knew that it would really hurt him badly to do that. So they weren't just affairs and flings. She wanted to do it in a way that would hurt him as much as she possibly could.
So would you tell us about June 10th, 1981, and the events leading up to that violent day?
So Jenny got married in 1970 to Tip, and throughout the 70s, starting like in the mid-70s or so, she started confiding in her friends that she wanted to get divorced from Tip, that she couldn't stand it anymore. She wanted to split up. She wanted to get divorced. She went and talked to her first divorce attorney who had represented her when she divorced Paul. And what she found out was Tip had a ton of money at the time. And what she found out from the attorneys and from everyone else who was telling her, they said, if you want to get divorced from Tip, you can do it. If you just want out of the marriage, you can do it, but you're not going to get anything. You're not going to get any of his money. You're not going to get any of the money that he's made since you've been married. The way the law works in California, you need to be married at least 10 years before you're entitled to half of what he has. So that was in Jenny's mind, that she needed to make it to 1980, at least to 1980, to get half his money. And Jenny didn't want to work, so she wanted to get a few $1 million of Tip's money or their money and move on with her life from there. So despite how bad their marriage was, she stuck it out. And finally, in early 1981, she filed for divorce from Tip. She moved out. She got her own place. She got her own condo in Beverly Hills. She moved out, and I can get into the story of what happened, but basically what happened is on June 10th, 1981, Jenny and Tip Roeder were both gunned down outside of Jenny's condo on Holt Avenue in Beverly Hills. Jenny was shot twice in the head. Tip was shot once in the stomach. Jenny died on the spot, and Tip died about 2.5 hours later. And the only thing that people knew for decades, the only thing that her fans knew or that her family knew or anything, was one newspaper story that was right after the murder happened that said that they were probably gunned down because of an apparent robbery attempt. That was, until I found out what happened, what really happened in there. That's what everybody always thought, that they were gunned down. It was a robbery attempt gone bad. The bad guy had shot both of them, and that's why they died.
As a newspaper guy, what are your thoughts on how their deaths were covered? I mean, the name she was known as on screen, it wasn't mentioned at all, right?
No, that's what's fascinating to look at now, is that there was only one article done. The Los Angeles Times did an article on it. And when they did the article in there, the headline of it and the lead of the story in there was that a well-known attorney, Tip Roeder, had been shot along with his wife, Jennifer Roeder, in there. The reporter didn't know, nobody knew at the time, that the wife in there was actually far more famous than the husband was in this murder. That, she was just relegated in the story to being called wife in there, and she was actually, 20 years earlier, she was the hottest actress in Hollywood at the time. So this was, of course, long before the internet, so they couldn't Google and find out, okay, who was this woman really? But if the reporter had just taken a little while to delve into who was this woman who was killed, at the time they would have realized, wow, this was not just some attorney's wife who was gunned down. This was a pretty famous Hollywood actress, and we might have a bigger story here than we thought. So the way our family found out about it, and the way I found out about it, is my mom had gotten a call from one of our cousins over in Norway, who was kind of like the family busybody. She was in touch with all the uncles and cousins, and she knew everything that was going on. Her name was Venki. And so Venki had called my mom and said, oh my gosh, it's something terrible happened. We don't know any of the details, but Jenny was just murdered in Los Angeles. We don't know any details at all. And my mom just starts crying. She hadn't seen Jenny since they were kids, but she just adored her, and she just was sobbing. So she called my sister, and then she called me, and my mom was living in Illinois at the time, and I was a senior at the University of Michigan. She called me up and she said, Jenny got murdered. Jenny Maxwell, my cousin, she got murdered. And I said, what happened? He goes, we don't know. The word in our family was that her husband, and none of us had ever met Tip Roeder. The word was that her husband was a mob attorney, and that maybe this was a mob hit, that the mob was trying to murder Tip, and she ended up just getting in the way. So that was the kind of the thinking in our family. Again, this is long before the internet, so I couldn't, go online and look at anything. So I was working for the student newspaper, the Michigan Daily, at the time. So I knew at least a little bit about how newspapers operated. And I figured there was probably somebody back at the LA Times that I could call, a librarian or someone who might be able to read the story to me. So I did that. I called the Los Angeles Times, and I said, I'm wondering if you had a story in there about this woman, Jennifer Maxwell, who was murdered along with her husband. I knew his name, so I said his name, and she said, well, hang on, let me check. So she called me back a little while later, and she read me the story over the phone. And the story was just the one that was the only one that's out there that said that they were gunned down as part of an apparent robbery. So that was really the last that we knew about it. That was all that we had. My mom then, called Venki and called the rest of the family and told them what that newspaper story had said. But none of us, until I started digging into it, none of us ever thought more than that's what happened.
It's a little weird, right? I mean, he was a prominent attorney. And as you mentioned earlier, part of her appeal for him was the fact that she was a Hollywood actress. He showed her off in public. People out there had to have known she was the person killed, right? It's surprising no one contacted, a newspaper that there could have been this kind of disconnect.
Yeah, and what as I found out after I found out what really happened with the case, if the reporter had even called back a couple weeks later and said, talked to the detective who worked on the case, just said, "Hey, I'm wondering if anything ever happened with that case," he would have told them what happened in there. But nobody ever called to follow up on this case. It was from a newspaper person's perspective. Yeah, I look at that as a terrible failure that they didn't bother to follow up on it. Because if they had, then this case would have been solved back in 1981 instead of being solved in 2021, and everyone would have known what happened to her.
So how does that work? You say that the case was solved in 1981, but it's also considered a cold case.
Yeah, and after I tell you what happened, after I tell everyone what happened with the thing, you'll see that it was solved and it was still a cold case at the same time. So, but the way that I finally got into this story is, so this was one of those things that had kind of been weighing heavy on our family through all these years, particularly on my mom. But I would also talk to my uncle about it, my mom's younger brother, about it a lot. And my mom always wondered what really happened with Jenny. She kind of wanted to make sure that it was nothing that Jenny had done, that she wasn't like mixed up in drugs or something herself, and that was a drug dealer trying to gun her down or something. She wanted to. There would have just been some comfort that she could have taken in knowing that Jenny truly was a victim and that she didn't have anything to do with this murder case. But it was, that just the not knowing part of it is something that would always weigh on your heart as a family member. What happened is in 2019, in early 2019, my mom's health was starting to fade a bit. She wasn't doing well. She was living down in Florida. Her health wasn't, we knew it was just a matter of time. And I just got it in my head one day that, you know what, I'm going to try to find out if anyone ever found out what happened with Jenny Maxwell, her cousin. I'm going to, see, or maybe I can even encourage the police down there. If I get a hold of someone, maybe I can encourage them to reopen the case to find out what happened. So to make a long story short, I started looking up I lived on newspapers.com. I found as many of the stories I could find out about it. In that story that was in the LA Times, they quoted a beat cop in there who was like the first person on the scene. I was able actually to track him down. It was a guy named John Dial. So I tracked him down, got an email for him and a phone number. I talked to him and he said, yeah, I remember the case, but I was just the responding officer. And, to be honest, I don't know whatever happened after that. And then he told me what department or what division it would have been that investigated it. It was the Wilshire Detective Division. So I called the Wilshire Detective Division, talked with this guy who was like in his 30s, never heard of this case, didn't know anything about it, but he was fascinated when I told him about it. He said, "Oh, let me look and see if I can find anything." So he went and he looked. He said, we're just now starting to digitize a lot of the stuff from the early 1980s, so we probably still have the actual like file here somewhere. So he's really like invested in this case now. He's like excited about it. So this guy goes and looks, and then the next day he calls me up and he said, "Well, I found the folder for the murder case in here," and he sent me a picture of the file tab on there that had their names on there. And he said, "But there's nothing in there other than just the initial report in there. There's none of the notes as to how it's solved. So this is just the first one, the first incident report. So I don't know whatever happened to the rest of it." But on this tab in there, it had the names of two officers, the officers that it was assigned to. And one of them was named Rogers and the other one was named Thies. So, of course, now I start looking to find out, okay, who are Rogers and Thies? Maybe I can track one of them down. So I was able to track down Mike Thies, the detective who worked on the case back in 1981. I found an email for him. I emailed him. I, told him who I was. And I had a conversation with him in early February of 2019. And I, told him, I said, "I'm, Jenny's my second cousin, my mom's first cousin. I was wondering if you ever know what happened to that case, if you remember it." He goes, "Oh, I remember that like it was yesterday." He said, "We actually solved that within about 10 days of what happened in there." And then he told me what happened, and I was able to tell my mom. And then it was about 2 weeks later that my mom passed away. But she at least had the closure in her heart of knowing what happened with her cousin.
That's
And
amazing.
then the book came about because so now I have all this information, and you know I'll obviously talk through what I found out, but I flew out to this is early 2019. So in May of 2019, I flew out to LA. I met with Mike Thies. He showed me he had gotten from the police department some of the notes from the case and the file and everything. We sat down together. We went over to the murder scene. He showed me all around there. I went and stopped in and met my second cousin, Brian Rapp, for the first time. Had a long conversation with him about everything. And this is 2019, so now I'm getting all this stuff, doing all this research. I'm going, what am I going to do with this? Am I going to write it? Do I want to write a newspaper article? What am I going to do? And then COVID hit, and I'm a huge sports fan. And like all of us in early 2019, we're sitting at home, March, April, of 2020, when COVID hit, we're all sitting at home with nothing to do. So I decided that, okay, this is a sign. I can't watch any games at night because that's always what I would do, whatever happened to be on. So starting in April of 2020, every night I would write a chapter of this book. So it was during COVID that I wrote the book, and then I ended up finishing it in late 2020. It came out in early 2021. But what I found out when I talked to Mike Thies on the phone, then went out there is basically what happened with the murder, and it was absolutely incredible.
Right. Yes.
So Mike Thies got assigned to the case right away. So they start finding all this evidence right away when they're out there. The first thing that they notice at the scene is that Tip Roeder's car was parked right outside where they were gunned down. What had happened is that Jenny had gone into the hospital, Cedars-Sinai Hospital, the day before for a procedure called the DNC, where they had to basically scrape out part of her uterus to see if she had any cancer in there. It was a pretty invasive procedure. She had to spend the night there, and she had just gotten out of the hospital on June 10th, and Tip had volunteered to pick her up at the hospital and bring her home. She had a good friend of hers that she was confiding in, who I actually talked to, who said that when Jenny called and told me that Tip was going to pick her up at the hospital and bring her home, I said, Jenny, that's a terrible idea. That's an absolutely terrible idea. You don't want anything to do with Tip. He goes, no, he's being really nice to me now. I think, maybe he wants to get back together or whatever. But yeah, I'm just going to he's going to pick me up. Maybe we'll have lunch and then we'll just go home. It's not that big a deal. So Tip picked her up at the hospital about 1:00 on June 10th. They ended up going to get something to eat at a little deli near there. And then about 3:00, they got to Jenny's condo on Holt Avenue, and then the murder happened. And when Mike Thies and the other detective were investigating it, they noticed that there was a Tip's Lincoln Continental that was parked out there. So of course they look at the registration papers and they find out that the car's not registered to Tip. He was driving it, but it was actually registered to a guy named Red Tracton, who was a very well-known restaurant owner in Los Angeles. And inside the trunk in there were 4 guns and a whole bunch of ammo were located in the back of the trunk. It's going, okay, this is very, very interesting here. So when they ran the ballistics on the bullets that had killed them, they found that they were this really, really rare ammunition. It was called Super Vel. It was these bullets that were incredibly potent, that were made in Indiana. They were popular among police and criminals in the 1970s, but they became so expensive to make that they weren't making Super Vel anymore. There was this really rare ammunition. So the bullets that killed them were some of the Super Vel ammunition. And when they look in Tip Roeder's trunk of the car, they notice that the bullets that were in there were Super Vel. So they said, okay, blew their mind. This is not a random attack here. However it happened, Tip Roeder knew the person that killed them because he either gave them the ammunition or the guy stole the ammunition from Tip. But this was not a coincidence that there was Super Vel bullets in the trunk of his car, and it was the same, ammunition that just killed me. So then Mike Thies said, okay, we need to go talk to Red Tracton, who was the owner of the car and the owner of the steakhouse. So Red's Tracton Steakhouse was this well-known place in Los Angeles that was the mob hangout in the 1970s and 80s. If you think about the movie Goodfellas, when there's the scene where the camera's going through and they're introducing all the bad guys, and everybody's a mobster in the restaurant along with their girlfriends, that was basically Red Tracton Steakhouse. That was the place where all the mob guys hung out. Red Tracton was not in the mob himself, but he knew everybody, and that's where all the bad guys hung out. And he had gotten to know Tip really well because Tip had done some legal work for him. And Tip was in the restaurant all the time, talking to, all these bad guys, many of whom he had arrested back when he was a cop, some of whom he was representing now. So, they went and talked to Red Tracton, and Red told them, he said, why did Tip Roeder have your car? He said, well, he had done some legal work for me, and he said he didn't want me to pay him. He just wanted me to give him a car that he could drive around. I said, okay, what about all these bullets and guns in the trunk? He said, well, I don't know anything about that, but I do know that like a week or so ago, Tip was in here and he was talking to somebody, and it was somebody who was not from L.A. because I didn't recognize this guy at all, but he was in here talking to somebody, and then next thing I know, a week later, he and his wife were gunned down. So I said, all right, well, that's a huge tip itself. So that was the first thing that really set them on to solving the case and finding out what happened.
I think Red Tracton's Steakhouse still exists.
I think it might. It's not in its original location. Red died a long time ago. He was involved in not to get too far off the track here, but Red Tracton was involved in a fascinating case himself in the 1960s where there was a kidnapping case. And Red Tracton ended up being the intermediary, the guy that had to like collect the ransom money and give it to the kidnappers. And while he was doing that, they ended up getting finding the guy. So Red Tracton had a really interesting background himself, and he had kind of shown up in a lot of these ancillary stories along the way. So the big break in the case came though when Mike Thies said, okay, we know that this was not a random killing. We know that they were targeted. We know that Tip at least knew the assailant because he gave him the bullets, or the bullets were stolen from him in this case here. So now we need to figure out the rest of the case in there. So the big break came when they went to talk to a guy named Danny Stewart, who was a former cop who was now a private investigator. And Danny Stewart was a rogue cop that Tip had represented in a case about 10 years earlier where he was convicted of, they did a big drug bust, collected a lot of marijuana from this drug bust, and instead of turning the marijuana in, Danny Stewart kept it. And that ended up getting him in a whole lot of trouble. So Tip represented him, because Tip represented a lot of former cops because he knew all these guys. Ended up getting Danny a lot lighter sentence than he normally would have gotten. But Danny Stewart's career as a cop was over, so he became a private investigator after that. So Mike Thies said, I'm going to go talk to Danny Stewart because I know that Tip has done a lot of, or hired him to do a lot of things, and, maybe he knows something in this. So he went and talked to Danny Stewart, and that's when basically he solved the case. Because what Danny Stewart told him was that Tip had come to him just a week or so before this happened. And he said, Danny, I'm going to hire you to do a job. So what do you want me to do? He said, I think that Jenny is looking to hire a hitman to kill me. So I want you to shoot her before she has a chance to shoot me. What I want you to do is I want you to kill Jenny, and it'll be a time when we're together. And then I want you to just graze me with a bullet. Just wound me a little bit so we can make it look like it was like an attempted robbery. But I want you to kill her, and I want you to just wound me. And Danny Stewart told him, go to hell. I'm not doing any of that. But now they figured out, okay, this is what happened. So they start talking to a few more people. They find out that Tip also approached this other guy he knew who was an accountant who had some shady things in his past, asked him to do the same thing. There was one more guy that he hired to try to hire to do the exact same thing. That guy also turned him around. So what they finally figured out is that was what was going to happen. Everything matched up. Everything totally lined up as to how this happened. The fact that Jenny was shot twice in the head and Tip was just shot once in the stomach told them that they weren't trying to kill both of them, whoever this person was. So that would make sense that, the orders were to kill Jenny and just to wound him. So what they finally figured out, and this is why it is technically still a cold case, is that Tip had met with some mobster, some hitman at Red Tract and Steakhouse, had hired him to do the job. And the guy did it, and he ended up shooting Tip a little too well. And instead of just wounding Tip, he shot him too much in his stomach, and he bled out 2.5 hours later. So that's how the case was solved, that it was really Tip Roeder who was behind it all. So we know who was behind it, but we don't know who actually pulled the trigger, and we probably never will.
You write that Tip Roeder might actually have been emboldened from a confrontation he had a few months earlier in his backyard with an intruder, correct?
Yeah, what they found out in the case of the course of investigating this was that a few months earlier, Tip had been shot. That there was somebody he had come across in his backyard, and some intruder or something. We don't know who this person was, but Tip confronted him in his backyard, and this guy ended up taking a shot at Tip and winging him in his back. And Tip didn't want to make a big deal of this because he didn't want to attract attention, and for whatever reason, probably because he had a lot of guns at his house himself that weren't all legal and registered. So he didn't report this to the police, but they found out about it after the fact. So what Mike Thesis' theory is that shot demonstrated to Tip that he could take a shot. That, getting shot's not all that bad. I got shot once in the back before, and it hurt like hell, but I ended up getting it stitched up, and I was okay. So I'll just have the same thing happen here. So yeah, he was probably emboldened by that getting shot's not that bad.
Right. Little did he know.
Turned out that didn't turn out very well.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. What was your mom's reaction when she learned of her cousin's fate? Was she surprised?
Yeah, I'd say she was very surprised by it. Not having known Tip. We never met Tip. No one in our family ever knew him or met him at all. So, we didn't have any thoughts about him one way or the other on it. So it was like shocking that would be the case. But in a large sense, she was also, and this sounds strange to say because it was, still a tragic murder, but she was, in a sense, she had closure and relief that it was nothing that Jenny had done, aside from marrying an awful person. It was nothing that Jenny had done that had caused this to happen. Jenny was not involved in anything illegal or bad. It definitely gave her closure on the case. So I think that was a huge relief to her.
Do you think that there's a chance that the killers will ever be found, the actual hitmen?
I doubt it. Mike Thie said that they're not really investigating this case anymore. I think he said the only way that it ever would be solved would be that if, and this is 43 years ago now that this happened. He said the only way that it would be solved is if somebody ends up getting arrested for something, and in the course of the investigation, they find out, oh yeah, he was also involved in this case in LA back in 1981. But other than that, he said that we had zero leads in terms of who he actually hired. It was a professional. It was somebody that knew what they were doing in terms of not being detected or caught. So they investigated it for a while after that to find out who the hitman actually was, and then there were no leads, no credible leads. So I doubt that the real killer is ever going to be caught. So right. It's a strange criminal case, in the fact that it was solved and it wasn't solved. It was solved in knowing we know who hired the hitman to do it and why they hired the hitman to do it. We just don't know who the hitman was.
And this brings up more questions, correct? The death of Nick Adams, for instance. Now that it's been established that Roeder was not above murdering someone, I mean, Adams died of a lethal combination of drugs. He wasn't shot, but Roeder could have been behind that, potentially.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people, myself included, who think that Tip probably did kill Nick Adams. So what happened in that case is, this is back in 1968, Nick Adams was found dead in his home of a drug overdose. It was a lethal combination, like you said, of drugs that killed him. The person who found him dead in his house was Tip Roeder. They were supposed to have dinner earlier that night, and when Nick Adams didn't show up for the dinner, Tip got nervous and said, boy, this is not like Nick to not show up. So he went over to his house, snuck in a window in the house, and went in there, and he found Nick Adams sitting up in his bedroom, dead from these lethal combination of pills in there. But very suspicious at the time that Nick Adams would have known this combination of drugs would have killed him. There would have been no reason for him to just take these drugs mistakenly in the quantities that he did. So even before the truth came out about Jenny Maxwell and that Tip Roeder was behind that murder, there were a lot of people, including Nick Adams' kids, who suspected that Tip might have had something to do with it. And now that we know that, as you said, that Tip is capable of murder, or at least of arranging murder, there's a thought that something happened between Nick Adams and Tip Roeder, that they'd had a falling out, that Tip had been stealing money from Nick, and Nick was getting ready to turn him in. There were also rumors about Nick Adams' sexuality, because he was involved in certain things with Elvis Presley and James Dean that had people thinking that maybe Nick Adams was gay. And so there was a thought, okay, is Tip trying to blackmail him? And now Nick is going to go to the cops with that information. So there were a lot of theories about why Tip would have had motive to want to kill Nick Adams. But when you look at how suspicious that death was, there are people who think that Tip gave him that combination of drugs, that Tip would have known as a cop that he had seen that combination of drugs would kill people, and he somehow gave it to Nick and told him, this is what you need to, let me go get your medicine and take this, and that ended up killing him. That's another one that's not, it's never been proven at all, but we certainly have a suspect in that case as well.
Interesting. So your book was published in 2021, as we've said. Has there been any new information gathered in regards to this case in the last few years that might require a second edition?
Yeah, a lot of information has come out since the book has come out. So what happened with the case itself, and it's like the last chapter of the book in there that I talk about it, is that so Tip had 5 children. He had 5 daughters by 3 previous wives, and Jenny had 1 child, Brian. And neither one of them had, or Jenny did not have a will that was separate from Tip. So the way their estate worked in there is that because they were only separated, they were still technically married at the time, is that if they had both died at the same time, then their estate would have gone equally to their children. But if one of them dies first, then the surviving spouse gets everything, and then that spouse then gets to decide what to do with it. So this was just a tragic bit of circumstances, but because Jenny died immediately, the second that Jenny died, because Tip was still alive, all of Jenny's belongings and her estate and everything went to Tip. Then when Tip died 2.5 hours later, all of his estate and everything went to his 5 children. And Jenny's son Brian got nothing simply because his mom died 2.5 hours before Tip did. So when Brian found out about this, he knew his mom didn't have a whole lot, but there were a few personal belongings that he really wanted. There were some pieces of her jewelry he would have loved to have. He told me this story, the thing he really, really wanted was he had a dirt bike that they kept out at a house they had in Idlewild, which was on a lake in about 2.5 hours outside of LA. He really wanted his dirt bike, but Tip's daughters refused to give Brian anything in there. Nothing that was his, nothing that was his mother's, anything at all on there. So that was really kind of a tragic thing that happened after the fact in here. But when I was writing the book, I did track down one of Tip's relatives. It was a niece of his who gave me a lot of information, but I was never able to talk to any of his children. And I finally, after the book came out, I tracked down one of his daughters, and I tracked down another. One of his other daughters had passed away, but her husband was still around, and her son was still around, and I was able to talk to them. And what was fascinating to me is that none of them, nobody in Tip Roeder's family, knew what really happened in the case. It was them looking at the book, reading the book, and then talking to me when they found out that their father hired a hitman to essentially kill himself, to kill his wife and to kill himself.
Wow.
So I was the one who had to tell Tip's kids that this is what happened. So that just blew me away that they never found out. The police told Brian what happened. So he's known all along. He's known for the last 43 years what happened to his mom, but Tip's kids never did.
Gosh,
Yeah,
that's
in one case, it was when I was talking to the son-in-law, Tip Rader's son-in-law in there, he hadn't read the book yet or knew anything about the book. So when I was the one who told him, it was like you could almost, I was on the phone, but I could almost hear his jaw dropping to the floor going, "What? Oh my gosh." He said he didn't believe it at first. I don't know if he changed his mind after that, but said, "Well, I'm just telling you what the police said."
right, right. You're just the messenger. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're
Well,
not a,
that was pretty fascinating. The other one of the responses I got from his other daughter was that she was obviously shocked, but she said, my dad was not the best person in the world, so I'm not totally shocked.
well, this has been so excellent. So there are ways for listeners to connect with you on social media.
Yeah, we have a Facebook page, Murder of an Elvis Girl. We have some other pictures of Jenny through there, and I guess one of the things I want to really get out on here too is that Jenny had a lot of flaws. She made a lot of bad decisions, but she didn't do anything to deserve what happened to her. And ultimately, she was a beautiful person. She, not only a beautiful woman, but she just had a beautiful soul. And in talking to her son Brian, and him telling me how close they got toward the end of her life when he was in his teens, and Jenny was only 19 years older than he was, so they were essentially kind of in the same generation on there. He said we were friends. We used to every weekend we would go out and we would just go have sushi, or then we'd come back to my house and drink wine and just talk all night long. So it kind of warmed my heart knowing that she was able to turn that part of her life around and have that kind of special relationship with her son after all the mistakes that she had made early on. So she didn't deserve any of this. She was an incredibly talented actress, and my mother just absolutely adored her on there. So just for that alone, I was heartened to be able to find out more of her story, to tell more of her story, and really to be able to have some closure into what happened to her.
Well said. Yeah, yeah. Well, for those who believe in karma, I guess the man who put out the hit ended up paying for it with his life.
Exactly.
And probably in a far more excruciating way than she did.
Absolutely. She died immediately. He did not. That's an excellent point, Eric.
Yeah, gosh. Oh.
And the book, if anyone does want to read it, the book's available on Amazon. There's a paperback or Kindle. There's a whole lot in there also about her Hollywood life and everything that happened as well. I learned so much when I was researching it too about how Hollywood worked at that time. And as a result of doing it, I talked to a few friends of hers who were actress friends of hers in Hollywood at the time, and it was a wild time. It was a very wild time.
Yeah. Well, thanks again. This has been so great. Appreciate your time.
Eric, I really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Again, I have been speaking to Buddy Moorehouse. He is the author of Murder of an Elvis Girl, Solving the Jenny Maxwell Case. This has been another episode of the Most Notorious Podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Eric Rivenis, and have a safe tomorrow.